Good morning, and welcome to day 108 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at another of the 8th century prophets, the prophet Hosea, specifically Hosea chapters 1 through 3. And these chapters really embody the message of the book as a whole. Now, one of the things to remember when we're looking at the prophets is that often God would call the prophets to perform symbolic actions, to embody their message, to make a physical demonstration of a theological point. So that one of the prophets wears an ox yoke around his neck for an extended period of time to show that the people are about to go into exile, and it will be like a return to slavery when they were oppressed in Egypt. Perhaps the greatest example of one of these prophets is the prophet Hosea, because God calls him to marry a woman of promiscuity, Gomer. And we don't know for sure if Gomer was a prostitute, though verses like Hosea 2:5 that talk about the exchange of sexual activity for physical provisions from multiple men have led many to conclude that. But we do know that she was promiscuous, probably before, but also after her marriage to the prophet Hosea. And this in turn was a demonstration of the relationship between God and Israel. Israel repeatedly was a promiscuous wife, going after all sorts of other providers, gods, in the Old Testament. Importantly, from the beginning of the Bible, the relationship between God and mankind is often closely associated with the marriage relationship, man and wife. You see it in Genesis 1 and 2. You also see it in the New Testament in Ephesians 5, where Paul talks about Christ and his church being represented in the microcosm of marriage in the way that the man and the wife relate to each other. In the Old Testament, this word zanah for spiritual adultery or promiscuity is used 60 times. Over 20%, 13 of those uses occur in the book of Hosea. In fact, the only book that has more uses is the book of Ezekiel, which has 17 uses, but it's much, much longer than Hosea. So Hosea has the greatest concentration of this message of spiritual adultery and its consequences. And in Hosea, that's embodied through these three children that are born to Gomer, at least two of which implicitly are suggested might not belong to Hosea. So in the opening verses, after God calls him to marry this woman, he says that she is to go in and that Hosea is to go in and have a child with her. And it says in verse 3, so he went in and married Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son, and the Lord named him Jezreel. And this is a reference to 2 Kings 9 and 10, where God raises up Jehu to besiege the city of Jezreel and overthrow a wicked king by the name of Omri. God does not let Omri's sin go unchecked. Unfortunately, Jehu shows himself to be just as wicked as Omri had been, so God portends judgment for Jehu as well. Likewise, God used his people to overthrow a wicked king, Pharaoh, but they've shown themselves time and time again to be just as adulterous spiritually and wicked. So God's saying Israel's sin will not be without consequence. Then there's a second child, and this child, it says that she conceived again and gave birth. Notice that it doesn't mention Hosea the second time, or that say that the daughter was born to him. She conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and the Lord said to Hosea, name her Lo Ruhama, or Lo Ruhama, which means no compassion or no mercy, for God will no longer have compassion or mercy on his people. God's compassion and mercy are celebrated throughout the Old Testament, but Israel came increasingly to expect the compassion without honoring the covenant, treating God flippantly while expecting God's consistency. God says there's going to be consequence for this national sin. There will be no compassion. And then a third child was born. And again, notice that implicitly it suggested Hosea may not be the father. After Gomer had weaned Lo Ruhama, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, which means not my people. For centuries now, Israel as a whole has been treating God as though he's not their God. So God's going to turn them over to the treatment of being not his people. So you have this progressive embodiment of the message of judgment that is coming against God's own covenant people. And that's a strong point in Hosea, but notice that the message does not end in judgment, but with the hope of restoration. Right after talking about that, it says, "Yet the number of the Israelites will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or counted. And in the place where they were told, 'You are not my people,' they will be called sons of the living God. And the Judeans and the Israelites will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves a single ruler and go up from the land." And ultimately, this is looking forward to the reunification of God's people, the redemption, the restoration of God's people through the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Just as Gomer sells herself out and Hosea seeks after her, so also God sends his son to seek and save the lost, to bring his people back to him. Not only all those who are in Abraham, but all those who are in Adam. So that the man and wife relationship is ultimately demonstrated by Christ and his church, by a redeemed people and their covenant God who goes out to seek and to save them. So much more we could say, but we don't have time. So keep reading, reflecting, and responding to God's word, and I'll see you tomorrow. God bless.